We welcome to all the participants in this VCM on that one is PLI schemes. We have with us today's faculty, CA Rahul Agrawal, CA Saurabh Jain, and both the faculties are from E&Y, and right now they are working in that one is PLI schemes for the years. With this, we welcome to our resource person. We welcome to our vibrant, committed, and that one is our own Vice Chairman, CA Dr. Raj Chawla, to this session. And I am handing over the session to CA Dr. Raj Chawla for his address.
Thank you, Dr. Samit Mishra ji. Good evening to all dear professional colleagues. At the outset, I am happy to be part of virtual CP meeting of PLI scheme, Electronics, IT and Telecom, organized by the Committee on MSME and Startup of ICI. We are thankful to all the participant and resource person, CA Rahul Agrawal ji and CA Saurabh Jain ji, for joining in the virtual CP meeting. In order to boost domestic manufacturing and cut down on import bill, the central government in March 2020 introduced a scheme that aims to give companies incentive on incremental sales from products manufactured in domestic unit. Apart from inviting foreign companies to set shops in India, the scheme also aims to encourage local companies to set up and expand existing manufacturing units. According to experts, the idea of PLI is important as the government cannot continue making investment in these capital intensive sector as they need longer time for start giving the return. Instead, that it can do so to invite global companies with adequate capital to set up capacities in India. PLI are essential for incentives to companies to boost the products. They could be in form of rebates, import and export, duty concession, or maybe easier land acquisition terms. Generally, the benefit of a PLI scheme are passed on of the final consumers of the goods in terms of lower prices. Take the example of electric vehicle. They don't have ready demand, but a shift of greener automobile is essential for the country. In this regard, the government has what is called the FAME scheme. It stands for Faster Adoption and Manufacturing of Hybrid and Electric Vehicle. Under this scheme are a whole lot of concession for EV makers. I am happy to inform you that today's session will highlight the PLI scheme, Electronics, IT and Telecom. We hope that your enhancement of the knowledge in the PLI scheme helps you in your future endeavor. Thanks and best of luck for your future professional and personal endeavor. Thank you very much.
With this, we are handing over the session to CA Saurabh Jain and CA Rahul Agrawal for further proceeding.
Sure, sir. So, very warm welcome to all of the attendees. And first of all, I'm thankful to Mr. Chawla sir for rightly setting the context for the today's session and putting a brief background of the PLI schemes. So before we dive into deep of the topic for today, a small introduction for myself along with me, Saurabh, who is a part for the today's session. So I'm Rahul Agrawal. I have an experience of 10 years in the part of indirect taxation and the incentive schemes presently in the EY. So I work along with Saurabh, who is a partner in the firm and is specifically looking after the incentive schemes implementation and the overall continuity of the same. So Saurabh, if you'd like to say anything.
Yeah. So very warm welcome to all of you. So basically in today's session, so we are going to cover the production linked incentive schemes. So I think if you have heard about this scheme, so the central government in the year 2020, so they started with electronic sector, wherein they introduced the scheme for mobile phone sector. And with the success of mobile phone sector, so the government has extended this scheme to various other sectors. So there are critical sectors which the government has chosen, and then they have extended this production linked incentive scheme to all those sectors. So the purpose basically of this scheme is to incentivize and bring up domestic champions who can compete in the global market and to boost the domestic manufacturing in India. So basically with this scheme, what government is trying to do is the government is trying to give incentive on incremental sales. So basically it will be kind of, there will be a base year, and over and above that base year, there'll be a scheme period. And whatever sales a company do in that particular, those years, the differential of the turnover from the base year will be considered for the purpose of this incentive. So there is like a lot of the companies can get up to 3 times, 4 times, depending upon the scheme framework. And there'll be different schemes which we will be discussing in detail in this session. So the government is providing incentives on those schemes, and once those incentives are given as a percentage of sales, so it will be refunded in cash to the companies. And apart from this scheme, so just an overview, even if we are government, this is the scheme which is provided by the central government, and there are a lot of other incentives which are being also provided by the state government authorities. So if a company is trying to set up a manufacturing in a particular state, then the state government is also providing incentives, and those incentives will be over and above the incentives granted by the central government. So if we look at the total bouquet of incentives which is being granted collectively by the central and the state government, so it's a huge amount which the government is giving. And there are participants, and we have seen a lot of interest from the global as well as the domestic companies who are coming up, participating, willing to invest, and basically making these schemes a success. So I think government in most of the sectors have done it bit, and now it's on the industry and how they will be performing in coming years to make this scheme successful. Because right now the schemes are successfully implemented on the papers, government has granted approvals, and now we need to see how the industry will perform, because they will have to do certain level of production and sales to get qualified under these schemes. So I think there are total of 13 critical sectors which the government selected, and we in this session will be covering electronics, IT, and telecom. So the first round of various schemes in these sectors have been completed, and with the success of those first rounds, the government is now planning to come up with the second round or the third round, which we will be discussing in detail. So that's the whole thing about the production link incentive scheme, which is being brought by the central government. Rahul, over to you. You can just go through these schemes in detail and then.
Sure. So Saurabh, I think I can present my screen. It is enabled now.
That's fine. I think I'll move it.
Okay, so we can move to the next slide. Thank you, Saurabh. I think Saurabh has very well summarized the overall summary of the PLI scheme and what the current status is, with the government already granting the approvals, and now it's the onus is on the industry to actually achieve the targets what they have estimated. Now, before coming to the details of the PLI, let us first understand why the government is pushing towards the production link incentive schemes. So as you all know, the government of India is running the Make in India program. The very objective of Make in India is the entire manufacturing of whatever the consumption, or even for the global consumption, the idea of the government of India is the production should be happening in India. Now, for the purpose of ensuring the overall Make in India program a great success, there are a lot of factors which comes into play, which government is step by step ensuring that the same should happen, be it in terms of the overall ease of doing business, how your import and export supply chain works, overall tax environment, be it in terms of direct taxes, be it in terms of the indirect taxes with GST being implemented. Now, there remains another very important criteria in terms of manufacturing, and whenever anybody is expecting any startup or even the multinational clients to set up such huge facilities in India. So there are a lot of factors which comes into play, and the most important factors is the profitability criteria and the overall competitiveness in the global supply chain. So the idea behind the production linked incentive schemes is more to ensure and to bring the global giants and also encourage and the MSMEs in the, already existing in India to start set up the manufacturing facility. And the government should also, government wants to incentivize them for the purpose of setting up this manufacturing facility in India. So the production link incentive scheme, the idea is to provide a specific percentage of whatever the goods are being manufactured, and the sale could be irrespective, be it in the domestic market or be it in the export market. So the incentive is not linked to what is being sold, whether it is domestic or whether it is exported. The incentive under the production link, as the name suggests, is basically linked to the manufacturing, whether the manufacturing happens or not. So the three major bucket, as I mentioned, for the intent behind the production link incentive scheme is to encourage domestic manufacture of goods in India, increase the global competitiveness for our production, because we not only intend to manufacture and sell domestic, but the idea is that a substantial portion should also be supplied outside, and we have a global and we have a significant share of the global supply chain. And again, the third idea is presently the lot of finished goods have been constantly importing. The import value have been significantly increasing day by day. The idea behind is that those imports shall be substituted with the manufacturing in India. And by the manufacturing, the government strongly emphasizes that there should be a significant value addition in India, and not only in terms of the assembly happening in India, there should be a significant value addition in India. We will also see how there are various aspects in the respective schemes where the government is ensuring that a significant value addition should happen in India, because that is only the thing that is finally going to ensure the success of this scheme. Now, there are various pointers which the scheme covers. So just to summarize, as Saurav mentioned, the government has specified specific sectors. In the subsequent slide, we have summarized those sectors wherein the specific PLI scheme has been introduced. Now, in the second column of this slide, if you see, the idea of the PLI scheme is to give a specific incentive. The incentive could be based on the percentage of the sales that is achieved. Second, there are certain schemes wherein the government is providing a specific percentage of the investments that is being proposed. The idea over there is the project cost or the overall investment, that if there is a significant investment, then the government is also trying to incentivize or provide the incentive through a percentage of the project cost. Now, again, the qualification criteria. So this is again one of the very important criteria for these schemes, because only granting the approvals to the respective applicants under the scheme will not fulfill the objective. The government has to ensure that whosoever is the applicant, they have the right background, they have the right technology, they have the right experience, and as well as the overall support for the purpose of manufacturing the various products that is covered in the scheme. So that is why the government has ensured that there are specific criteria under each of these schemes depending upon the sector specific requirements or the conditions. We will deep dive into this subsequently once we discuss more about these specific schemes. Now, second, again, the idea is to, as I mentioned, not only to bring the global giants into India, but also to ensure that the Indian companies, Indian domestic companies, MSME sectors also are encouraged to have a good share of domestic production in India. So that is why the qualification criteria under each schemes have been separated for the global companies as well as the domestic companies, because obviously one cannot have the same qualification criteria for the global companies who have their operations at a very large scale in comparison to domestic companies or MSMEs who are catching up the scale right now. Now, again, one thing in each of these schemes, the government has ensured that there are separate agencies which are being appointed who act as a liaison between the respective ministry who is implementing the scheme and then the industries who are finally applying the scheme. So this ensures a proper communication both from the government side and as well as from the industry, because once the scheme is implemented, there are a lot of ambiguities which happens, which industry players wants to have clarity upon. So the scheme agencies or the specific agencies plays an important role in the implementation of the scheme, be it in the application process or the final disbursement process. So we can move to next slide. Yeah. So these are the overall sectors wherein the government has either introduced the scheme or they are planning to bring up PLI incentive schemes. And even there are some of the sectors wherein the government is even considering to bring a second round of PLI, considering the demand of the industry, considering the demand of the players. So if we see over in this slide, the last column wherein the data center, wearable and the hearables, these are the another scheme wherein the government is trying. The discussions are already going on. The draft policy is in place. The government is getting the inputs from the industry players, and the scheme will be announced soon for this particular data center, wearables, and the other hearing devices. Now, apart from all these existing schemes, we also understand that for the IT hardware, telecom, white goods, a lot of electronic components and solar PV modules, even for these sectors, government might come up with another round of production link incentive schemes in the coming period. So majority of these schemes, as we see in this slide, are already over for the application at present. What we understand, specialty steel products, drone, and the design-linked incentive schemes and the semiconductor components. These are the schemes in which the applications are presently being accepted, and we have another window. For rest, one will need to wait for the another round of PLI, which the government comes up. So in our session today, we'll be focusing on three PLIs, which one is the semiconductor PLI, for which this is the recent PLI, rather the most recent PLI which the government has been, or this is to put it in another word, I would say this is the most ambitious PLI of the government of India, because there are very limited players globally who are presently into the manufacturing of the semiconductors, considering the scale and the overall volume of investment that is being required. Second, telecom and the IT hardware PLIs. So for both of the PLIs, we are expecting that government will come up for the second round of applications, and therefore it will be good for interacting and discussing and having shared the knowledge for these specifics of the schemes. Yeah. So within the semiconductor, the overall semiconductor scheme has been basically divided into the four parts. One is the semiconductor fab, that is the chip-based semiconductors that we see every electronic devices that we are seeing in our day-to-day life, be it computer, be it laptop, be it mobile, any other electronic devices or the home appliances which have the connectivity nowadays through Bluetooth. So in every electronic devices, a semiconductor chip is basically the heart of any electronic devices in today's world. So one is the semiconductor fabrication. The second is the display fabrication. The whatever, be it mobile phone or the TV screens, the AMOLED screen, we keep hearing this word nowadays in terms of mobile screens, LCDs. So second is the display fabrication part. The third scheme in which within the part of the semiconductor is the so semiconductors, there can be different compounds of semiconductors, and the next step of the semiconductor fabrication is basically the assembly, testing and packaging. So that is the third scheme. And the fourth scheme, once before the production of the semiconductor happens, the designing of the semiconductor is very important part. There are thousands of designs which are to be made. There are a lot of engineers which are into designing, because once the design is there, then only the production happens. So the government also wants to incentivize the designing of these schemes. So these are the overall broadly four buckets within which the overall semiconductor ecosystem which government wants to implement. So starting with the first one, the government has an overall budget outlay of 76,000 crore for this particular scheme. So as I was mentioning, so under each scheme, as the government for the purpose of PLI has an overall budget, if you see over here, there is a 230 crore overall budget. So for each scheme, government embarks a certain amount of money. So even for the PLI schemes, the government has embarked an overall budget of 76,000 crores. And within this budget, the overall scheme is going to be implemented.
And
this
particular scheme is basically different from the other schemes, because as we were discussing, in most of the PLI schemes, the incentive is being granted as a percentage of sale. However, this scheme is different, and here the government, the incentive which the government is giving is linked to the investment which a company is going to put, because as Rahul mentioned, all uh, semiconductor manufacturing, it needs a huge amount of investment, and there are like other facilities or subsidies which are required from the government side, and government, after considering all those things and getting the uh, and getting inputs from the industry, so has basically framed this particular scheme wherein the incentives are being granted as a percentage of capex which a company is going to put. And this is huge because the capex will range between 30 to 50%, which is being granted by the central government under each of the scheme, and over and above, as I mentioned earlier, so the state governments are also willing to give 10 to 15%. So if a company is going to put an investment and they get back around 50 to 60% of the investment from the government. So I think that's a huge amount of money which the government is willing to give to all those companies who are willing to come and invest in India. Rahul, you're on mute.
Sorry. So coming to the specifics of the scheme, again, under each scheme, as I mentioned, the government notifies the eligible products which will be eligible for the incentives. So here in this particular scheme, the fabrication of the semiconductors, there are specific semiconductors sizes which are notified. For this particular scheme, the government has notified that this particular applicant who is willing to make the application under the scheme, so they should either have the already existing facility who is manufacturing the semiconductor fabrication of the specific size of 65, 45, and 28. So in a semiconductor industry, the smaller the nanometer is, the more advanced the technology is. As we move forward, the 28 is constantly decreasing, and that's how the advancement of the semiconductor fabrication is being considered. So for the operational experience, again, as I earlier mentioned, that the government needs to ensure that whosoever is the applicant, they have the right background and the capability to implement once the approval is being granted. So either the applicant must have the facility, or they should at least have the technology for the manufacturing of 28 nanometer semiconductors or an advanced version of that. So that is the basic criteria. Then again, coming to the specific part, this is the eligible product under the scheme. That is, the wafer size is being notified. The capacity is also being notified. And the last criteria, which is one of the important criteria, and we have been discussing that for the purpose of semiconductor, the investment is really huge. So the minimum capital investment that is being required is 20,000 crore is the overall budget. So again, this is one of the minimum investment required, and whosoever is the applicant, so this is they also should have a minimum revenue of 7,500 crore in the past 3 financial years. So this particular criteria of having a specified amount of turnover for the goods is being considered in most of the PLI schemes, as we have been seeing. So generally the government requires, it's not necessary the applicant should have, even the group companies together, if they achieve this particular number, they are being considered eligible. So the overall idea is the group has the capability and they have the experience in implementing the scheme. So further, each scheme have a specific period wherein up to which the government will grant the incentives, as the incentives can't go on for without any end date. So generally for this particular scheme, the 6 year is the tenure which the government has notified for the purpose of grant of incentives. For the FAB scheme, the application window is already over. What we understand as of today, the government is already analyzing the applications and is with the implementation with the India Semiconductor Mission, that is the nodal agency implementing the scheme. And we will soon hear about the final applicants who have been granted approval under the scheme. Again, as I mentioned, so at least 2 applicants, this is what the target of the government is to provide under the semiconductor fab scheme. India Semiconductor Mission, sorry, as I mentioned, is the body who is implementing the scheme. So now, in comparison to the other schemes that we have been seeing, before granting the approval under the semiconductor scheme, there will be a lot of evaluation which the government will be doing. So that is why in the scheme guidelines itself, the government has specified the quality and cost-based selections. So there will be a lot of discussions on the, because the applicants have to clearly demonstrate that what is the technology they are going to use, what is the overall costing that they are expecting for the project to be implemented. So and how they are going to improvise the technology over the period. So there are a number of factors which the applicant needs to justify, and basis that the government will finally approve the project with a particular project cost, and thereon the incentives will be granted. So if we move to subsequent slides, for the different types of eligible goods manufactured, the incentive granted also differed. So as I mentioned, the lower the nanometer is, the more advanced the semiconductor fabrication is. So for 28 nanometer or lower, the government is will be reimbursing the 50% of the project cost. Between 28 to 45, it will be up to 40, and then 45 to 65, it will be 30% of the project cost. So one of the important factor in the project cost for the purpose of this scheme is within the project cost, the capital expenditures are being defined, and this particular scheme includes the value for the land and building for the purpose of granting the project cost. In most of the schemes, the land and building are being excluded for the purpose of grant of the incentives, and generally the incentives over there are based on the as a percentage of the sales criteria. So as Saurav mentioned, this is the central government scheme, wherein within this scheme, the government is reimbursing the project costs. So apart from this, there are each states have their own industrial policy. Even few of these states are coming up with a specific semiconductor policy. UP already has that. We understand Karnataka is considering. So there also, the state government also provides a lot of incentives, be it in terms of infrastructure support, electricity, electricity subsidy, electricity duty subsidy, power cost subsidy, water supply benefits. So there are a lot other benefits, both in terms of fiscal and the non-fiscal benefits, which each industry can consider apart from the benefit that one is getting under the semiconductor project cost benefit under this particular scheme. So other than this, if we see within the electronic manufacturing, the government is also trying to create an electronic manufacturing cluster. So the idea is, unlike SEZs, they have a common facility is being developed, where there is a developer who develops the entire area, and then there are a lot of units who set up their units. They have the common facility so that the cost is reduced. So idea behind the EMC is to have a particular cluster being developed, and thereon the various units, because the semiconductor is a very long process, starting from the fabrication, then it goes into assembly and dicing, after the dicing, testing, and finally the packaging and going on. So there will be multiple units involved in the overall process of the production. So the government is also, through various other schemes, are trying to set up the EMCs. There is another scheme which the government of India is already implemented, that is the preference to make in India, wherein with the specified amount of domestic value additions, the companies get the preference in the PSU tenders which comes up. So that is how they ensure the preference to such companies who are meeting the Make in India objective of the government. R&D skill and support. Again, R&D is one of the important factor in today's technology and the electronic environment, with the ever-changing technology and on day by day. So every day we are seeing that there is a change in technology, and whatever was developed in past, so that is no more required, and there is a new technology. So R&D is a very specific part which the government focuses. So therefore, in the overall scheme, there is a specified 2.5 amount, 5% of the outlay, which the government has ensured should be granted towards once the company invests into R&D. Because at the end of the day, we have to ensure that our product is as per the current market standards and the latest technology.
And all these benefits, so basically whatever Rahul has talked about in the last three buckets, so all these incentives are in addition to the incentive of basically the reimbursement of percentage of project cost what the central government is giving. So any company which is coming under this category or investing under this category will also be eligible for these additional incentives. And so now, right now, basis the news, what we are hearing is around 3 companies have put the application under this scheme, and the state governments are also really active, like the government of Gujarat and government of Karnataka. So though both the governments are pretty much active and competing in terms of the benefits which they are granting to the companies, and also like there'll be other state governments who will be coming up with similar policies, so that they can also attract the investment in the particular state. Yeah, Rahul.
Okay. So moving on to the next part is the display. So again, the display fab, as I mentioned, we keep hearing the most 30 to 40%, or rather, yeah. So what I was mentioning that again, the display fab forms a significant part cost of the BOM for the any electronic device, be it mobile phone or the television that we are seeing we use. So this is, and again, it is a very complex process and a very huge investment required. So again, the idea is again, as in the earlier scheme, the company or the applicant who intends to apply under the scheme, they must either have the existing facility who is capable of manufacturing these as required, or they at least have the technology and a path and the required technology for the development of this. So the eligible goods again are specified under the scheme, that is the TFT LCD with having the specific Generation 8 or above, and this is the capacity requirement that needs to be achieved, and second for the AMOLED. So the capital investment over here is 10,000 crore in comparison to the 20,000 crore that we discussed earlier. The minimum revenue criteria for the preceding financial year remains the same. As I mentioned, in most of these schemes, the government has kept this criteria so that to check that the applicant is or has the relevant experience in manufacturing this. So rest of the part remains the same as in the earlier scheme. The government will be granting the benefits for 6 years. The application for this is already in place, and the government is evaluating the applicants. The beneficiaries over here is maximum 2 applicants, which is specified under the scheme, and the agency bodies and the other criteria remains the same as we discussed earlier. When we move to next slide. So here the project cost. So earlier, as we discussed, so depending upon the semiconductor fabrication, the overall project cost is up to 50%. So again, if we see in these schemes, so there will be a negotiation process at the time of granting the approval. So the applicants will have to show that whatever what is their estimate of the overall project implementation, what is the capacity that they are going to achieve, what is the technology that they are going to use, and how relevant is that. And all this basis, you will need to justify that what is the amount of project cost reimbursement or the project cost incentive that the applicant wants from the government to ensure that the particular project that the particular applicant is considering is viable for the same. Because at the end of the day, it's the bottom line and the profit. Unless the profit, the project is not sustainable. So additional incentives, as we discussed earlier, remains the same. One another important criteria under this scheme is government has specified the maximum support. So 12,000 crore is the maximum support within this particular scheme, since there is an overall budget of 76,000 crores. So within that, so government is also specifying the overall budget for each of the FD schemes. So within that budget, the respective project cost incentives will be granted to the applicants. Yeah. So the third bucket, as we discussed earlier, the semiconductor fabrication is a very long process till it finally gets into the electronic product. So, and the semiconductor can be of different compounds. So this particular scheme covers the various semiconductors which are made up of different, that is a compound semiconductors, be it silicon photonics, the sensors, which are again based on the semiconductors, and ultimately all these items together goes on the PCB board, which makes the final PCBA, which goes into our any electronic devices that we are using in our home appliances. And lastly, what is covered under this is the ATMP unit, basically the assembly, testing, marketing, and the packaging of the final semiconductor chips that is being made. So these are the two buckets which are covered under these schemes. So the criteria remains the same, but overall the minimum capital investments that is being required to make under this scheme is different in comparison to earlier. For example, in the compound semiconductor, as we could see, the wafer size is notified 150 to 200, and the installed capacity is 500 or more wafer starts. The minimum threshold criteria is 100 crore, which is depending upon how the industry is, the government notifies. So again, all these numbers are, government has done the extensive discussion with each and every industry players before this scheme is being implemented. Basis the inputs from the industry only, that what is achievable, what is the minimum investment that this kind of industry requires. The government has notified the minimum amount of investment or the sales which may be required for the purpose of the scheme. And again, for the ATMP units or the outsourced ATMP units, because a lot of companies outsource this particular part of the process in the semiconductor fabrication to any third units, as we can see. And the criteria for investments for them is the 50 crore in comparison to 100 crore earlier. So here, similar to earlier schemes, the government will be providing the project cost, a specified percentage of the project cost. So that is the 30% of the overall project cost, which the government will be providing. The project cost is basically the capital expenditure, and each scheme clearly defines that what are the individual expenses which will be considered under the capital expenditure and which should be capitalized in your books of accounts as per the normal accounting standards. So if we could see over here, the capital expenditure includes the building, clean room, plant and machinery, the equipment, technology, and the R&D part. So all these are considered as the capital expenditure for the purpose of the scheme. And the overall eligible capital expenditure, so there will be a long drawn process once this capital expenditure are being incurred, as a process of, we have to submit the respective details with the authorities who will look into the eligibility of the expenditures, and thereafter the project cost, the 30% or the whatever the respective project cost is to be granted, will be granted based upon those criteria. So window for this scheme is unlike other two schemes which are already closed, which was 45 days. So there's a 3-year window period, because once the semiconductor or the display fabrication happens, so this entire setup, there is a huge 2-3 years period is required to set up this plant because of the complexity involved. So, and these being the next step for this. So there is a 3-year window period which the government has kept for these particular schemes. And starting from 1st of January 2022, for next 3 years, the eligible industry can make the applications under this particular scheme. And the nodal agency for all the semiconductor applications remains the same, that is the India Semiconductor Mission. So as I mentioned at the beginning, so manufacturing is the one part of the semiconductor. Fabrication happens, finally the assembly, testing, packaging happens, and it goes into the electronic device. Design is the very core of the semiconductor. So it is the design of the semiconductors which is the very basic step, and thereafter everything happens for the production and everything. So in this particular scheme, so government has also tried that those individual domestic companies, startups, and the MSMEs who are into the designing of the semiconductor chips, be it integrated circuits, systems, IP cores, and all these designs companies should also be incentivized for the purpose of this. So again, for this, the period is 3-year window for the purpose of claiming the incentive starting from 1st of January 2022. If we move to next slide, we'll see the incentives that is being available under this scheme. So there are basically
before moving further, so I think this particular scheme, so government is focusing on the domestic companies and the startups or the MSMEs who are into the designing of the semiconductors. So basically, I think most of the startups in India, so because they have been uh, doing design in India, and those companies are something which the government wants to cover and focus here. So this particular incentive will not be granted to any foreign company. It has to be an Indian company. It has to be a domestic company in terms of the FDI policy to get the benefit of this particular scheme. So there are two parts of it. One, Again, so here this scheme is also further divided into two parts. One is the capex incentive and one is the sales incentive. So the company who is particularly designing and putting investment, so there'll be a percentage of incentive which will be granted to those companies, and also basically those companies will have to prove that the design which they are making is basically can be usable or sellable in the market, basis which they will also get the incentive on the sales linked to that particular design. Yeah.
Yeah. So the first bucket, as you can see, and Saurav also mentioned, there are two types of incentive which the government will be giving under this particular scheme. So one will be the design link expenditure scheme, because for the purpose of designing, there are a lot of cost is being incurred, be it in terms of the IPR, be it in terms of the designing costs. So all those goes into the eligible expenditure as summarized over here: testing, fabrication, validation of the prototype, filing of the IPR. So the government is or will be reimbursing this eligible expenditure, the 50% of this, wherein it has a cap of 15 CR per application. And once the design happens, there is a deployment of the design to the particular manufacturer who is engaged actually into the manufacturing of the chips that we discussed earlier. So there also depending upon how the arrangement is, whatever will be the sales revenue for the purpose of supplying the design schemes. So a specified percentage ranging from 6 to 4% of that sales revenue will also be incentivized with the overall cap of 30 CR per application. Apart from this, as earlier mentioned, the government is also trying to develop the overall infrastructure and the support both in terms of fiscal and the non-fiscal ways. So there is a specific authority, that is CDAC, which is within the MIT department only. The idea of this, that they will support the industry since the startups and MSMEs are there, so that they have a repository of all the IPRs, all the new developments that is happening into one particular place, and support all the players who are considering or who are evaluating to get into the scheme, and develop and help them for the purpose of designing and implementing and starting their production and starting their design, and finally actually getting the incentives from the ministry. So this was the overall semiconductor discussion that we had, basically categorized into the 4 buckets. Now, moving on to the next PLI incentive scheme, which the government has already implemented, but as we earlier mentioned, that there is a second round of discussion which is going on. So telecom and the telecom products, again, a very important part of our telecom industry, be it on the 4G and the 5G, all the telecom players, be it Airtel, Vodafone, everybody, there is a huge deployment in the back end of the telecom products through which we are able to have the mobile connectivity or the internet connectivity nowadays. So again, the idea is majority of these equipments are being imported, or even if either imported as a finished goods, or even if not as a finished goods in an assembled form, the value addition in India is very limited. So the government has again specified very exhaustive list of the products which are being covered under these schemes. So as I mentioned, under each scheme, government notifies the products which are being covered. So Saurav, if you can click on the annexure A, we will go to those. So these are the specific products wherein the different category has been notified. So broad category has been notified under the yellow bucket, and thereafter the specific product name under that. So transmission equipment, customer premise equipment, whatever modems we are using in our houses for the purpose of getting the internet connectivity, those are generally called the customer premises equipment. ONTs nowadays, through which we are able to access 4G and the 5G network. There are routing or the switching apparatus which are deployed at the back end of the telecom network for the purpose of enabling our telecommunication and the internet facility. So all these specific products have been notified, and the companies or the applicants needs to ensure that they are manufacturing these products for the purpose of getting the incentives. So if you click on the left yellow button, we'll go to the same slide. These were the products which has been notified under the Telecom PLI scheme. So coming to the quantum of the scheme, so here there are two categories notified. Again, the idea is there should be both MSMEs as well as the other than MSME players who are getting the benefit of the scheme. So the government has set up different criteria as well as the different incentives. So for MSMEs, it is in the 6%, slightly high for MSMEs over here. And again, there is an overall budget lay for the next 5 years of 12,000 crore, which the government intends to grant under this scheme. And there is a specific amount which is being earmarked for the purpose of MSMEs of 1,000 crore out of this overall budget for the purpose of granting the scheme. So one important aspect that I want to touch over here is the base year. So in each of the scheme, there is a base year. So the idea behind the base year is, so there may be a lot of applicants who are already into manufacturing these products, and they will obviously also be intending to apply for this scheme. So the intent and the idea of having a base year under each of the PLI scheme is applicant has already made before the filing was already achieving. The applicant has as over and above that sales turnover for the purpose of granting this benefit under the scheme. Because anyways, without the PLI scheme also, that particular applicant was able to make the requisite investments, achieve the sales turnover. So the idea behind to have more sales and the more is that should continue, and there should be something extra which the government is ready to incentivize. So for each scheme, the government has notified a base year. For example, this telecom scheme was made applicable from 1st of April 2021. The base year for this was set up for 1920. So for the 1920, the government will select your base year that much was the sales that has happened this year, and whatever the sales you are projecting in future, that should be over and above that. So that is for the purpose of base year, and we could see in most of these schemes that this is being there, and this is the idea and the objective behind that. So coming to the some of the key features of the scheme. So under this particular scheme, unlike the semiconductor, as we have seen, where the government was granting a specified percentage of the project cost, here the incentive is a specified percentage ranging between 4 to 6 or 4 to 7, as we saw earlier, of the overall sales or the incremental sales revenue. And there is a specific investment also that the government has mandatorily required under the scheme to be achieved. So that investment can be achieved in a staggered manner over the period of next 4 years, and each year the minimum investments has to be achieved and the minimum incremental sales. So there is a cumulative criteria for the purpose of grant of that cumulative criteria covers the investment and then covers the incremental sales part. Once both of them are fulfilled, then only any applicant will be eligible for the purpose of grant of incentives under the scheme. So again, the tenure over here is 5 years. For the next 5 years, starting from 21-22, the government will be granting the incentives under the scheme. So just for your update, unlike in the mobile PLI also, the government has extended the scheme for from 2021 to another year, considering in the initial years there were COVID and the applicants were unable to achieve the relevant criteria. So here also the lot of industry players, since the scheme started last year only, it started from April 2021, but almost the half year has gone by the time the approvals and everything was granted. So a lot of industry players have represented to grant another year for the purpose of grant of incentives for this, which we are still seeing that whether government is considering or not. Coming into the more specifics, as I mentioned, there are two criteria under this scheme. One is for the MSME and second is for other than MSME. And again, the minimum criteria for each category will be different. For MSME, there is a 10 crore minimum investment threshold that the government has notified, and for other than MSMEs, we will have a higher criteria, because other than MSMEs, there will be global manufacturing clients, be it Nokia, Ericsson, or the other players who are considering, who have already considered, and there will be MSMEs, the domestic players who will be considering that. So as I mentioned, land and building, though it was eligible under the semiconductor scheme, but here the investments for the purpose of determining the eligible investment under the scheme, the land and building will not be considered. So it has got no impact directly on your incentives, the exact amount of incentive that you will be getting. But yes, for example, for achieving the 100 crore or the minimum amount of investment, whatever the applicant is investing in the land and building, that will not be considered for the purpose of whether you have achieved the minimum investment or not. So this 100 crore is to be achieved excluding the value of land and building. So sales threshold, again, for the purpose of grant of incentives, the government has put a minimum and the maximum sales threshold under this scheme that the applicants need to achieve. So there is a limit for minimum sales also, and there is a limit for maximum sales also, within which the overall incentives will be granted. So again, the idea for all these factors or the pointers are that since there is a overall limited budget, and within that budget only the final incentives are to be granted. So the table over here summarizes what we have discussed. So this is how in this scheme the government has decided to grant the incentives. So the incentives, as I mentioned, will be granted over the period of 5 years. And for each category, for each year, the government has defined the minimum investment that has to be made. For example, in MSME, it is 20%, 40, 70%. And then finally, in the 4th year, the 100% investment has to be achieved. So the 20% of the 10 needs to be achieved in first year. Now, 3 times of that 20% of X will be considered as a minimum sales that an applicant is required to achieve. So this is the minimum sales that one applicant has to achieve. And there is also the 20 times of the sales that the maximum that an applicant can achieve. And on this incremental sales, the percentage of incentive will be granted. So sort of you can move to next slide. We have one example over here, which so for example, as we saw in the earlier slide, if the 100 CR is the investment and the requirement for the investment in the first year was 20, 40, 70, 100. I am on the first table of this screen. So the investment goes like 20, 40, 70, and 100. The incentive percentage is 654. So the minimum sales that an applicant need to ensure for the purpose of getting the investment is in the year 1, the applicant has to ensure that there is an investment of 20 CR plus there is a minimum sale of 60 CR. Then only once both this criteria are achieved, the applicant will be eligible for the grant of incentive. And similarly, the maximum sales is basis the 20 times of the investments made. So there is no D-bar on if the applicant wants to make the entire investments in year 1 or year 2, they can make that investment depending upon their project plans. But this is the minimum investment that the government has notified that needs to be achieved for the purpose of eligibility of incentives.
So in case any applicant fails to achieve any of the criteria in a particular year, then the incentive for that particular year will not be granted. And however, so let's say, for example, the applicant in year 1 is able to achieve the criteria of minimum investment and minimum sales. In year 1, the applicant will be eligible for the incentive. In year 2, let's say the investment criteria is met, but not this, what the sales criteria is not met. So in that particular year, no incentive will be granted. And that incentive will also not be allowed to be carried forward to the future year. So once in the 3rd year, the applicant is able to meet both the investment and the sales criteria, then again in that particular year, the applicant will be eligible for the incentive from the government.
Right, and in that particular year, it will be the incremental sales for that year. So basically, your past incentives which were not achieved because of the particular criteria will no more will be eligible. Yeah, we can move to next slide, Saurabh. So few of the points, as again I mentioned that there is an investment criteria. So the government under each scheme has defined. So what is the meaning of plant and machinery? Within the capital expenditure, what will be the covered? For example, in the telecom scheme, these are the heads broadly where basically the eligible investments will be considered. The investments in plant and machinery and equipment, even the second-hand investment into plant and machinery is also allowed with a specified criteria of 5 years of the residual useful life of the asset. Backed by the certificate from the relevant authority. R&D, there is a specific focus on the R&D. So even the R&D costs are also covered as an eligible investment. So there is a cap of 15% there will be a lot of technology transfer which the applicants need to have from the specific industry. So that is also being allowed for the purpose of eligible investments under the scheme, and the associated utilities, be the IT and the ITS infrastructure, which is nowadays a essential part of the any manufacturing or the organizational setup. So all these are being covered for the purpose of grant of investment. So again, each year it is defined, the investments has to be made from a specified period, which in the present case is April 21. The investment should be capitalized in the books of accounts. A few factors like the invoice date will be considered for the purpose of grant of the incentives. Land and building, as we discussed, is not a part of the incentives eligible investment to be considered. And each year the incremental investment will to be seen for the 100-year. So if your base year, your investment for, say for example, already you had the plant and machinery of 100 CR and you are into a non-MSME category. So each year the additional investment has to be made. The first year will be 20 crores, the second year will be another 20 crores, so that you cumulatively achieve the overall investment requirement over the period of 4 years. Yeah. So we can move to next slide. So again, this is another PLI scheme which the government has implemented and will be coming for another round. That is the IT hardware PLI. So within the IT hardware PLI, there are again the specified products similar to what we have seen earlier, be it in the semiconductor scheme, be it in the telecom scheme. So government notifies the specified products. So similarly over here, if we move on to next slide, we will see that there are specified products for the purpose of the target segment, be it the, so under this particular scheme, it is the laptop, tablets, all-in-one PCs, and the servers. Servers are basically the backbone of any nowadays data industry, where all the data are being stored. So these are the eligible goods for the purpose of this particular scheme. So again, over here, as we saw in the earlier scheme for the purpose of Telecom PLI, that there were two categories, be it MSME category or the other than MSME category. So here the government has defined it as a domestic companies where they have a lower threshold of the investments of 20 CR, and there will be the another IT hardware companies where they have a higher threshold of the investment thresholds. So with the investment thresholds, and there also are the sales threshold with the minimum sales that is being required to achieve. We will see in the subsequent slides. Again, this scheme was implemented from last year, from April 2021, and the government will be giving the support under the scheme for the period of over next 4 years. In the next slide, we will see that what is the specific criteria. So one of the different aspect, sorry, Saurav, I just missed one part, localization schedule. So as I mentioned earlier, that the domestic value addition is a very important objective behind the entire scheme, because the assembly of lot of electronic or the goods is already happening in India, but that is not giving the desired set of value addition in India. So under this particular scheme, the government has notified the various specific components which the applicant needs to ensure over the period of next 3-4 years that those are being localized. So the localization can be either the applicant themselves manufacture, or the same can be manufactured through a third party based out of India. But that has to be localized in India, and that is one in addition. So in the earlier scheme, the criteria for the purpose of grant of incentive was the investment, the achievement of the investment, and the achievement of the sales. So here there is an additional criteria for the purpose of grant of the investment. So there is a localization schedule. So that localization schedule one has to ensure that is being achieved for being eligible to receive the incentives. Yes. We will see in subsequent slide that what are the specific components which is being notified. So as I mentioned, each scheme has a qualification criteria. In semiconductor, we saw that there was a 7,500 crore turnover in the past 3 financial years. Similarly, in this particular scheme, what the government has notified, so different for the domestic companies and for the IT hardware companies. So either they have the turnover of 5,000 or 10,000, 10 crore in the target segment. Target segment is basically those goods which are being eligible for incentive under the scheme, that is laptops, servers, and PCs that we saw. And there was another criteria that where the government required that if you are not into the manufacturing of these target segment goods, even if you are into manufacturing of any other electronic goods. So for example, if there is any company who is engaged in the manufacturing of the, say for example, mobile phones or any other electronic devices, but not these particular target segment goods, and they have this turnover of 10,000 crore and the 20 crore. So they also will be eligible for the purpose of, were eligible for the purpose of making the applications under the scheme, and so on. Yeah. So this is the localization schedule which was being mentioned. So each year the government has defined the path which needs to be achieved for being eligible for the incentives. For example, from April 22 onwards, the applicants have to be ensured that the PCB assembly is being domestically happening in India. Subsequently, the PCB along with the battery packs. We move along thereafter, the power adapters are being included in the cabinets, chassis, and the enclosures are being also added. So every year the idea is the more and more the components that goes into the finished goods, those should be localized. For the purpose of 24, there are two categories. If these four components are being domestically manufactured, the incentives will be for the 2%. However, in the subsequent slide, we will see if there are the other two specific components, the incentive will be around 1% for that. So if there are these three, then the incentives will be 1%. So as I again mentioned, for each components, the components are also defined which needs to be localized, and it is also defined that whether that localization needs to be done by the applicant themselves or it can be through any other vendor, because nowadays most of the companies try to outsource some of the part of the overall manufacturing activity depending upon the specialization of the each case. So again here, so there are two buckets which are being divided between the domestic companies and the IT hardware companies. So as we saw earlier that the minimum investment criteria is different. It was 500 crore for the IT hardware companies for these products, and for the domestic companies it was 20 CR. So similarly, the incremental sales expectation once depending upon the size, that is also being defined. So 10,000 crore is the overall incremental sales over the next 4 years, which the IT hardware companies are required to be achieved, while in case of domestic companies it is a 300 crore which needs to be achieved. So these are the incremental sales which needs to be achieved for the purpose of being eligible for the purpose of grant of incentives.
So basically, how the incentive will be granted is number one. So there'll be two categories. One will be the IT hardware companies, which includes the foreign companies. And for foreign companies, the government has also done one thing. So they have also imposed a condition that the total value, invoice value of a particular product has to be, there has to be some minimum value. Like for laptops, the invoice value has to be 30,000 or above. And for tablets, it has to be 15,000 or above. So where the value crosses this particular limit, then on that particular turnover of those goods, for example, the sales of laptop wherein the invoice value is more than 30,000 and above, so only that those sales will be considered for the purpose of grant of incentive. So how it will be done is, one, there'll be incremental investment, and this incremental investment will be calculated over a period of 4 years on a cumulative basis. So in the first year, the applicant has to do, a foreign applicant has to do 50 crores of investment. And along with that 50 crore of investment, there has to be a minimum incremental sales of 1,000 crores. So whatever sales has been done in the base year, over and above that sales, so those so basically, if I have done 10,000, if applicant has done 10,000 crores, and in year of incentive it has done 11,000 crores, then it will be eligible for that incentive. So this is how the incentive will be calculated, and the values for foreign companies have been defined, but there is no such condition for the domestic companies. So for domestic companies, any value of laptop or tablet that particular company is manufacturing and selling, so that will be considered. And if you see, more importantly, the thresholds are also very low. So for a domestic company, the investment threshold has been kept at 20 crores, which has to be met over a period of 4 years. and a domestic company needs to do a incremental sales each year, which has been defined as in the table shown. So basically year 1 50 crores of incremental sale, year 2 100 crores, year 3 200 crores, and year 4 300 crores. So one important thing is the sales, incremental sales is independent each year, which a company needs to achieve over the base year, whereas the investment is cumulative, which needs to be achieved over a period of 4 years. Yeah, Rahul.
Yeah, I think sort of we have covered with this our topics for today. So yeah, you were mentioning something, Saurabh.
Yeah, so basically, Sambhiji, if there are any questions, we can take those up.
At last, at the end of the session, we can take the questions.
Okay, so I think these were the majority of the schemes which we were trying to cover for electronics, IT, and telecom. So apart from these schemes, there are certain more schemes which Rahul mentioned, like for data centers, which the government is deliberating, and it is under the draft stage, and those are basically going for interministerial approvals. Post that, the scheme will be notified. And data center scheme is something which is again similar to the semiconductor scheme which we saw, wherein the incentives are being granted on the basis of the investment which a company is which will be investing. So I think the government main intention is to cover all uh, the companies from all the fronts. Like for hardware, they have a separate scheme, IT hardware scheme, wherein the incentives are being granted. Then data center scheme, so all companies will be putting investment for setting up of data center in India. So the incentive will be granted to those companies as well, and I think that is something the scheme is awaited. Apart from that, uh, there'll be second round of telecom scheme which we just discussed, and the IT hardware scheme. There'll be obviously certain amendments because the industry is lobbying with the government for granting certain kind of relaxation or increasing the percentage of incentives. So those, after consideration of those requests from the industry, the government has deliberated and putting up a scheme wherein they will be coming up with the second round. And more importantly, so if we have saw from the news articles that the government for the companies for telecom scheme is also requesting to focus on the new technology which is upcoming, and also like bit be relaxed on the uh, product coverage, wherein the product coverage can change within a period of time, and the government should also consider the product which is basically based on the newer technology. So I think all those considerations are being taken by the government while drafting or while they'll be coming up with the second round. And we can see a lot of uh, requests of companies which are being considered and accepted in those schemes. So apart from the data center scheme, the another scheme which may come up is on the hearables and wearables devices, and those will be similar to what we are seeing on the screen for the laptops. So there'll be a percentage of incentive which will be granted based on the investment and the sales criteria. And also there could be two categories: one, the foreign companies and the domestic companies. And the foreign company, the government might bring up certain uh, conditions of uh, putting up the invoice value criteria, wherein the incentive to the foreign companies will only be granted wherein they are manufacturing and selling the devices, hearable and wearable devices, after a particular value which will be prescribed under the scheme. So I think that is one. And apart from that, the government is also considering uh, to bring up another round for the electronic components, uh, wherein there are two rounds which has already happened, and government has granted benefits to the companies who are willing to invest in specified electronic components which are being manufactured by those companies, and government is thinking to bring up another round with the leftover budget of the earlier two schemes, wherein they will be considering, and they may also increase some certain product coverage to include 2 or 3 new products, which as per the demand or as per the uh, demand of the industry which they are considering, and then they may bring up within other round. So I think that is all on the scheme side, which are there on the electronic IT and telecom, for the electronic IT and telecom industry. So Samajji, I think we have covered all the specific schemes which are there. Might be we can take up questions if you allow us.
Question, you just check it in the query box.
Okay.
Chat box.
Okay, so one question is whether advisory exclusively in PLI scheme worthwhile, having opportunities for CA having 10 years experience of corporate life. Yes, so I think PLI scheme is something which will open up new avenues for all of us, and this is something wherein we can start the discussions, we can talk to new companies and help them creating the awareness of what is coming, whether they are eligible or not. So the advisory is worthwhile because once you start doing this advisory, you can also basically help those companies in the entire end-to-end process of applying under the scheme, getting the approvals, and then getting them the incentives from the government. So it's kind of a refund which we do for all of the companies, and in the refunds as well, we do advisory, we do help them in the compliances, applying for those benefits and getting the money back. So it is worthwhile. Yes, it is worthwhile. And there is a lot of opportunities which we are seeing in the industry for the companies who are willing to apply. The next question is there any step-by-step process, handbook or format to avail benefit apply for PLI schemes? Yes, so I think there is no handbook which is there, but I think it depends upon the industry which you are looking at, and in case there is any specific industry, you can connect with us and we can provide you the details of kind of incentives which are available for those industries. We can only see these questions. So if there are any other questions,
no other questions.
Okay, no other questions. So Samaj, would you want to discuss anything else, or
now you just discuss any other thing left out? You just discuss it.
So I think 2-3 important aspects when we are talking to the clients. One, obviously, these central incentives. Apart from these incentives, or the other schemes under the customs, wherein whosoever is putting up the manufacturing plant would also be looking at how to optimize on the cost of that particular investment. So there are other schemes which are available, like manufacturing in a bonded warehouse, which we can help those companies to apply with and get the benefits of. So I think manufacturing in bonded warehouse is something where a company can set up a plant in a bonded warehouse, and that in that particular plant, all the imports of capital goods and raw material becomes duty free. So once you import any capital goods and raw material into that particular area, no duty will be levied, and you can use those raw material and machinery for undertaking the manufacturing process. So, and basically it's kind of a duty deferment where if you are selling in the domestic market, so in case those if those finished goods which you are manufacturing and you are selling it in the domestic market, then the company would need to pay the duty on the raw material which are used in manufacturing of those finished goods at the time of clearance of those goods in the domestic market. However, in case those goods are intended for exports, then there is no duty. So I think that is another scheme which the government is really looking at and focusing for most of the companies to apply, and those kind of benefits can also be considered once we are talking to any of our clients. In addition to that, obviously, the state incentives is something what we discussed, that all the state governments are granting incentives for setting up the manufacturing facility in the particular state. For example, UP, you get benefit a capex back of around 15 to 20%, and depending upon the amount of incentive, the benefits can be negotiated with the state government. So those benefits are there, which can be coupled with these schemes, and the central government schemes such as manufacturing in bonded warehouse. So all these schemes, if we put together, so I think there is a huge amount of incentives which the company can avail, and we can assist the companies for those type of benefits. I think that is it, somebody which we wanted to cover.
We are thankful to Mr. Saurabh Jain and Rahul Agrawal for their discussion on that one, is particularly PLI schemes.
Thank you, sir.
With this, we conclude the session. Thank you to all.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.